17 years ago, nearly no one in the English-speaking world had ever heard of a Witcher.
The Witcher.
The Witcher.
The Witcher.
The Witcher.
Witcher.
The Witcher.
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 The Witcher 3.
The Witcher.
I'm a Witcher.
Today, it's become a critically acclaimed pop culture phenomenon risen to the international scale. Following the industry-revolutionizing success of CD Projekt Red's Witcher 3 Wild Hunt in 2015 and the mass audience popularity of the 2019 Netflix series The Witcher, the title has firmly planted itself in the English-language fantasy lover's lexicon. And yet, our story is not as happy as it may seem. Nor is it yet over. Witcher is a known name by English audiences today, true, but what does it mean to them? Despite its market success, English audiences are still mixed on what The Witcher even is, what it's about, and how to engage with it. Before I even begin to analyze The Witcher books as fantasy literature, we must first take a step back and investigate. How did this Polish superstar land in the English language world? How does that initial landing affect its interpretation by English audiences today, including myself? And how might we begin to close some of the distance between us and their story? From its intertwined multimedia experience to its convoluted publishing timeline, to the very words printed on the page, in this multi-episode special, I'll be examining the unique and complicated circumstances of how the Witcher books were brought into the English language, taking a closer look at not only their market success, but some of the challenges resulting from this cross-cultural transfer, which, nearly 20 years later, continue to impact the reading and analysis of them in the English language. You're watching Vitre, and this is From Wiedźmin to Witcher, Episode 1, The Triumphs and Troubles of Transmedia. As with my previous video, my sources will be linked in the description. Special thanks goes out to sociologist Stanisław Krawczyk, who emailed me after my previous video essay and provided more academic resources for research, including one of his own lectures and the doctoral thesis of his colleague in translation studies, Paulina Drewniak, which were really interesting to listen and read through, and will become even more relevant in the next couple of episodes. So here's a big shout out and a thank you for the encouragement and the support. Part 1. The First Ventures. Where to start but at the beginning? The Witcher name, today internationally renowned, had humble beginnings. Published December 1986 and arriving in readers' hands January 1987, the first Witcher short story appeared in the magazine Fantastica as the third-place winner of a short story contest. Though he had initially not expected to write anything more about this Witcher, by 1991, author Andrzej Sapkowski had written multiple more short stories about this titular figure. By the early 90s, Witcher had been swiftly picked up by publisher Supernova, and Sapkowski went on to create an entire Witcher pentology, referred to as the Witcher Saga. This 5-book saga, published from 1994 to 1999, grew exponentially in popularity, gathering readers, awards, and critical acclaim from Poland and beyond. Rapidly becoming a pop culture phenomenon as it captured the zeitgeist of the 90s in Poland and economic transition to a capitalist system, Witcher had entered the mainstream and was a household name by the end of the decade. A few years later, in 2003, a small video game distribution company began work to create a game under the Witcher name, a project which would soon take it to heights previously unfathomed. But we'll get to that a bit later. Before their entry into English, the Witcher books already enjoyed great acclaim by fans and critics alike across continental Europe. The earliest translations of The Witcher, published in the early 90s when Sapkowski had not even yet finished writing the series, were in Czech and Russian, and by the late 90s, Witcher had also been translated into Lithuanian and German. Heading further west, Witcher had entered Spanish, French, and Portuguese, making English the 8th language in which a Witcher book was published. What was the first English translation of The Witcher? To answer that, we need to go back to the 2000s. It's the Great Recession. The first iPhone is released. Obama becomes the American president, and The Witcher appears in the English language for the first time. Well, okay, hold on there for just a second. The Orion Gollan's translation of The Last Wish and the release of the Witcher video game were not the first times Witcher had been brought into the Anglosphere. The earliest English translation of The Witcher that was published was in the year 2000 by Agnieszka Fulinska in the anthology featuring the winners of the Zytel Award chosen by fate. The Zytel Award was named for social science fiction writer Janusz A. Zytel, who had sadly passed away in 1985 before he could receive the fan-organized Sphinx Award. As it was renamed to the Zytel Award in his honor and presented at the National Convention PolCon, this award was intended to celebrate Polish speculative fiction. This became especially significant in the 90s, as English and American science fiction began to dominate the market after the country opened up following the transition from the communist government. At the beginning of the 1990s, to revitalize the award after a period of stagnation, the system of voting was changed to be more reflective of the fandom choice, following the example of the English Hugo, in which nominees were selected from proposals which people sent in. Voting then took place at PolCon Eurocon in Krakow, the result of which, in 1991, was a short story you might already know, The Lesser Evil, by Andrzej Sapkowski. As the Zytel Award had been to celebrate Polish writers within their own country, this anthology then was to introduce these authors into the hands of the English-language reader. It was published by Supernova, working in collaboration with the Śląski Klub Fantastiki, or Silesian Fantasy Club, one of the first speculative fiction fandom clubs in Poland, operating continuously since 1981. A quick interjection to say that, speaking of Silesia, southwestern Poland and a lot of Central Europe is experiencing a catastrophic flooding crisis right now, and it's actually said to be the worst flooding in over 2 decades. So I just wanted to say, I hope everyone in and from the affected regions is safe, and for the rest of us, I've left a link in the video description to the Polish Red Cross fundraiser where you can send support. Chosen by Fate, unfortunately, did not have a great effect in the English language market, and largely went without notice. Outside of Stanisław Lem, Polish speculative fiction was still little known to the English world. Sapkowski's Witcher would not enjoy far-reaching cultural impact in the English language until several years later, and under unique circumstances. Part 2. The Convergence of the Spheres. The first full Witcher book translated and released for market in English was The Last Wish, published by Orion Gollins. You might have heard a couple of different names for this group. Orbit UK is a sci-fi fantasy imprint of Little Brown Book Group. They have a sister imprint in the US, which handles the publication of The Witcher. Gollins is a sci-fi fantasy imprint of Orion Publishing Group, another UK publisher. Both of these are owned by Hachette Book Group. Now, that's a lot of names all at once, but the only thing you need to know here is that this is why US editions of The Witcher have Orbit on the spine, whereas UK editions have Gollins. Same company, different names. The more you know. The advanced reading copy of The Last Wish was sent out to reviewers in June 2007, then became widely available for market in February 2008 in the UK and May 2008 in the US. The release of the first Witcher game in North America occurred in between the releases of these copies, taking place in October 2007. This is the first interesting factor of note here. The Witcher game hit the market first, before the first book. More on that soon. The second factor of note here is that although the release of the first Witcher book and the release of the first game coincided in the English language market, the deals for either media had been made and carried out separately. The English translation and publication of The Last Wish and Blood of Elves was financed by the Polish Book Institute, a cultural institution promoting Polish literature. Their financing and planning with Sapkowski had to have been made years in advance, with such details estimated to have occurred around 2005, if not earlier. Similarly, CD Projekt Red, which was then a small studio compared to the AAA powerhouse that it is today, began to create a Witcher video game in 2003. So, though the book and game released around a similar date, they weren't initially connected. Their production timelines just happened to coincide. Chopin76 on Reddit, evaluating the situation several years ago, came to a similar conclusion, emphasizing the improbability of the English translation of the books to have even noticed the game's development. Some say that the translation got done because of the games. In my opinion, that's misguided. First, the publication lasts a really long time. In Poland, usually it takes at least a year from signing a deal to publishing. Here, we would have to add the time for the translation, meaning that the deal simply had to be signed months before the game was published. This is confirmed by looking at the CDPR forums. It claims that pre-orders were in 2006 and that the deal was signed in 2005. This raises the question, because they had signed these deals years in advance, having no affiliation with one another, then why did the English release of the books then end up becoming affiliated with the game? This is a third factor of note here. Chopin continues, "Do you really think that Polish Book Institute was paying attention to what some inexperienced obscure game studio was doing in 2005? Do you think that in 2005, guys at Gollins were thinking, well, in a year, some inexperienced studio in Poland would publish their first game ever, and it will be a huge success? No way. That also explains why Sapkowski keeps thinking that the English translation was before the first game, probably because he signed a deal a year or more before the game was published. And this proposed explanation tracks with the physical evidence we have of the difference between the advanced review copy and the market copy of The Last Wish. The cover of the advanced copy, from before the release of the game, had no mention of the game, not to mention a unique-looking wolf. But the market copies, from both the UK and the US, published after the game's release, either mention or just straight up function as advertising for the game, as well as the game's wolf medallion replacing the paper wolf on the cover of the UK edition. Additionally, from going on the Wayback Machine to see what Orion's web pages looked like for The Last Wish during these two dates, the version released June 2007, i.e. the advanced review copy, has only a cover graphic and review in its description, but the version released February 2008, i.e. the market copy, also features a promotional video for the game, linking the two. It seems that someone at Gollins decided to market the first book as game-related. I argue that initially they signed the deal because of the author's fame and lowered risk, since they get subsidy from the Polish Book Institute, but over time some clever guy saw the game relative success and thought, that's a great idea of how to market the book of a Polish fantasy author. Thus, although the book and the game were funded separately and their releases just happened to coincide, Orion likely quickly caught on to the release of the game and decided to advertise the book and the game as all part of one world, the international hit that inspired the video game The Witcher. Alright, so I actually discovered another image while I was editing of the back cover of the advanced review copy of The Last Wish, which does mention the game. It says that the book is published to tie in with an astounding new computer game, The Witcher. Which kind of defeated my conclusion here that the books and games were kept entirely separate until the first game's release. But, luckily, it doesn't really change the main point here, that in the English market, despite there not being any intention or even consent by Sapkowski to link the Witcher book and the Witcher game together, that's exactly what the English publisher did, and this would have huge ramifications. The result of all of this being that Witcher hit the English language market not as books, not as games, but as transmedia. But what is transmedia? Under the field of new media studies, American media scholar Henry Jenkins first originated the term transmedia storytelling in his book Convergence Culture, where old and new media collide. In it, he hones in on rapid developments in media and pop culture in the 21st century, in which new media technologies have begun to break down the walls separating media which have traditionally been kept apart. Unlike in the past, where each media had its own distinctive functions and markets, where you might have a book, a radio show, a movie, a television program, with digitization in the 1980s came convergence. Convergence for Jenkins is the flow of content across multiple media platforms, the cooperation between multiple media industries, and the migratory behavior of media audiences who will go almost anywhere in search of the kinds of entertainment experiences they want. In the world of media convergence, every important story gets told, every brand gets sold, and every consumer gets courted across multiple media platforms. Convergence involves both a change in the way media is produced and a change in the way media is consumed. He looks at how media production, ownership, and consumption is changing, both in the hands of corporate, from the top down, and in the hands of the consumer, from the bottom up. He writes that, ready or not, we are already living within a convergence culture.
The reality is that we are going to use a variety of media platforms for the foreseeable future. And the sense of us carrying content from one platform to another is part of the world we live in.
And out of this convergence culture comes our core concept for today, transmedia storytelling. A transmedia story unfolds across multiple media platforms, with each new text making a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole. In the ideal form of transmedia storytelling, each medium does what it does best, so that a story might be introduced in a film, expanded through television, novels, and comics. Its world might be explored through gameplay or experienced as an amusement park attraction. Each franchise entry needs to be self-contained, so you don't need to have seen the film to enjoy the game, and vice versa. Any given product is a point of entry into the franchise as a whole. You might be thinking, why are we making up new words? That's not transmedia. That's a franchise. You said it yourself. You're not special. But the two concepts are not equivalent. Though any franchise can have multiple offerings, novels, a television show, comics, transmedia isn't just selling a new offering under the same brand name. It's a method of storytelling, using a web of interconnected media. Jenkins explains how transmedia thinking contrasted with that of the previous franchise generation, where, for example, video games were only seen by movie producers as a potential extension of the brand, not an extension of the story. Increasingly, movie moguls saw games not simply as a means of stamping the franchise logo on some ancillary product, but as a means of expanding the storytelling experience. These filmmakers had come of age as gamers and had their own ideas about the creative intersections between the media. They wanted to use games to explore ideas that couldn't fit within 2-hour films. Later, he looks at the fully realized transmedia model of storytelling, of which he uses The Matrix as a prime example. The Matrix is 3 movies and more. There is, for example, The Animatrix, a 90-minute program of short animated films set in the world of The Matrix. The Matrix is also a series of comics from cult writers and artists. The Matrix is also 2 games, Enter the Matrix, and a massively multiplayer game set in the world of The Matrix. The Wachowskis wanted to wind the story of The Matrix across all of these media and have it all add up to one compelling whole. They mapped out this scheme we would do where we would have this movie and these video games and these animated stories, and they would all interact together. For The Matrix, the story is told throughout all of these different media, all relating to and affecting one another in a larger continuum. Though each valid and competent as their own separate, self-contained stories, from these various entry points, the universe becomes even more multi-layered and complex than the initial complexity developed by the original singular media. But for The Witcher, we have just one teensy-weensy little problem. The example that Jenkins gives, The Matrix, has the Wachowski sisters as united masterminds behind the decision to tell the story over multiple media. They had planned out all of the interaction between separate medias with foreseen, carefully constructed, authorial intention. And for The Witcher, not so much. Author Andrzej Sapkowski sold the rights to CD Projekt to create The Witcher video games. He sold the rights to Netflix to create the television show. And there are more, but these are the Witchers that dominate the Western market. The games narratively follow the book's ending, and the show is supposed to be an adaptation of the books. But the books themselves, Sapkowski's Witcher series, as he sees it and how his readers are intended to see it, are a closed cycle. Aside from the odd mid-quel he might throw out, cooked up from leftover story odds and ends, there is no adding to the Witcher books to create a larger story. The work that Sapkowski wrote from his perspective and supposedly from the reader's perspectives is done. It's complete. And yet, add to them is exactly what the market did. As opposed to how it had developed in its native Poland, first with the book series and then the games, Witcher in the English language market never existed as a book series. It was a game and a book series combined. It was transmedia. And this introduction of The Witcher had its effects, both positive and negative, for the series, its fans, and its interpretation. Part 3. A community is created.
Are basically mutated monster hunters who've been trained since childhood to protect the people in the land from supernatural creatures like werewolves and the undead and things like that.
At the time of the first game's release, Witcher was unknown as a name in the English language market. Matt Martin, for Eurogamer in 2007, writes, "Unless you're one of our readers in Polska, hello Jarosław and Lech in Warsaw, chances are you haven't read Andrzej Sapkowski's books based on The Witcher." Following the game's release, its success was noted specifically for how Witcher was a new name. Developer CD Projekt Red announced at PC RPG The Witcher sold over 1 million copies since its release in October 2007, a feat that the company claims is especially impressive for a title based on an unfamiliar IP from an unknown studio. Because of the unfamiliarity of The Witcher in the English language market, the games and the books had the opposite of the relationship which they had had in the continental European market. In Poland, the Czech Republic, Russia, Lithuania, Germany, and perhaps also Spain, France, and Portugal, Witcher was known from the books, first and primarily, because the books had arrived in these markets before the games did. Because of this, the games enjoyed the market's familiarity with this name. People liked the Witcher books and wanted to play the game based on it. Not to mention that the creators of the game were fans of the books themselves. That's part of why they wanted to make a Witcher game in the first place. But in the English market, in the UK and in the US, it was the opposite. Because the books and the games hit the market at the same time, In the beginning, neither media really enjoyed prior IP recognition. However, the popularity of the games grew rapidly. The first Witcher video game received positive reviews across the board, averaging an 8 out of 10 rating by critics. Especially as a work from a previously unheard of studio, it exceeded expectations. It was awarded one of the top 10 in Games of the Year of 2007 by GameSpy, writing, "Two major gameplay factors really pushed The Witcher over the top. The first is a fun, though challenging, timing-based combat system that makes fighting much more difficult and consequently more enjoyable than in a traditional action RPG clickfest. The bigger factor is the game's moral ambiguity. This plays out in a series of moral choices presented to the player where the impact of the choice isn't felt until much later in the game. In one example, a terrorist group of dwarves and elves, tired of discrimination and oppression at the hands of humans, tries to steal a cache of weapons. Geralt can let them have them or kill the raiders. Whichever choice he makes, he can still complete his current quest, but that action causes a ripple that will much later change what people and what quests are available due to a massacre that may or may not occur. Just like real life, the player must often make difficult decisions without enough information, blind to the eventual consequences. This is single-player RPG greatness. Don't miss it." Later, especially as The Witcher 2 found itself a devoted English-language fanbase, the game's popularity were what helped the books gain readership in the English market. Because the games and the books were linked together from the get-go, it made it a unique concept. The predominance of audiovisual media played a large role in The Witcher's rise in popularity for its English-language audience. Neil Postman, whose ideas I discussed in my previous video, talks about this at length, that we are no longer a society that primarily communicates through the medium of the printed word, and have not been for some time. When he was writing in the 1980s, television had taken precedence as the primary mode of communication. At the time of recording, we might say that new forms of online, digital, and interactive media take the primary role. Now, this doesn't mean that people don't read anymore, that books aren't read or don't exist. They are, and they do, but it means that the printed word is not how we, at least across societies with developed complex economies, primarily communicate and understand the world. It's not solely about the technology, but the culture. We are no longer a print-based culture. Rather, it is audiovisual media, radio, television, digital content, and yes, video games, which define our information, ideas, and epistemology. Now, what does this mean for The Witcher? In a fiercely competitive literary market, The Witcher books, if alone, may have gone off without a bang. From 2007 to 2008, there were over 80 newly published English-language fantasy novels of note, at least of enough note to be recorded on Wikipedia. And the English translation of The Witcher books, unlike, for instance, the Spanish translation, did not have an established fan base in English audiences prior to their publication. Witcher was a newcomer, and moreover, it was a foreign translation. We'll talk more about that in the next episode. But because the English fantasy sphere was and still is oversaturated with new English titles, though Sapkowski's Last Wish received favorable reviews from its advanced copy readers before the first game's release, it might have simply drowned in a sea of constant new fantasy books, had it not been for the success of the games. However, it wasn't just popularity which transferred over from the games to the books. It was everything. By adding visuals, atmosphere, and personal player experiences to The Witcher, the games lent an indispensable asset to the Witcher brand. Audiovisual media made it not only easily identifiable, but imaginable. Though perhaps today, the first game looks and plays as a relic of its time in comparison to today's modern titles, it had a very strong artistic and graphic direction which rooted itself in players' minds. Adam Badowski, head of art for The Witcher, writes in the Witcher art book that, familiar with Andrzej Sapkowski's prose, having a clear idea of how it should look in game form, we devised the overriding visual formula within a few weeks. The Witcher would draw on the dark fantasy genre and the best available example of it, Diablo 2. This was consistent with our vision of a brutal and grimy game world that would afford little room for charming illusions. We looked to historical sources to strengthen the credibility of our vision. I believe combining a dark fantasy aesthetic with the realities of 15th and 16th century Europe would be our best option, so the architectural, costume, character, weapon, and furniture designs reference late medieval and early Renaissance trends. We also incorporated elements from the late Renaissance, especially in its German and Dutch varieties, drew inspiration from Baroque paintings, the Dutch masters of the landscape and genre scene. Slavic culture also provided numerous aesthetic ideas. Drawing on multiple sources, from the dark fantasy genre of games, historic references, and their own love for Sapkowski's writing, the Witcher game made a great impression in players' minds. Because of this, and because most of the English audience were introduced to The Witcher through the games, this audience did not have to imagine the world of The Witcher for themselves, because it already existed in the video game. This is a very weighty element of our discussion, which we'll return to before this video is over. The Witcher Geralt of Rivia, to this English audience, was not necessarily a literary figure, a character from a book with 100 different ways of imagining him. CD Projekt already had imagined him, and would continue to imagine him, becoming more detailed and rendered over time. The first Witcher game famously sold over 1 million copies within its first year, greatly outdoing CD Projekt's expectations. Its successive title, The Witcher 2: Assassins of Kings, released 2011, found even more success, selling 1.7 million copies within its first year. Witcher 2 was a turning point for The Witcher and for CD Projekt. Though it shipped in 11 languages, it was primarily created with the American market in mind. While the first game had been created to primarily sell to the Polish and broader European market, sensing opportunity from their prior success, CD Projekt set their sights on the US during the development of their second Witcher game. With a much larger budget, they intended to conquer the Western market. Because of this, Witcher 2, at least in comparison to the first game, became a little more Western in its artistic direction, its bestiary, its references, and it had better English voice acting.
Witcher, this feels like a pivotal moment. What you do will have consequences.
And although its darkness was preserved in the writing and some aesthetics, overall, the atmosphere of the game changed from what it had been in the first game. Witcher 2, comparatively, looked more like a typical Western fantasy. It became less gloomy, more bright and exciting. Furthermore, Witcher 2 really capitalized on, or rather found itself partaking in the creation of, ongoing trends in Western fantasy at the time. Game of Thrones, the television series based on George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, released in April of 2011, Witcher 2 releasing May 2011, only 1 month later. Both titles, both hugely successful, focused intently on politics, assassinations, darkness, and moral complexity in the fantasy world. Because of this appeal to the Western market sensibilities, Witcher 2 found success not only as a video game, but as a Polish product of export. As a notable aside, in May 2011, the Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk gave American President Barack Obama several gifts, including the collector's edition of The Witcher 2. This speaks for itself, I think, to the significance which the Witcher name took on. This kind of success only skyrocketed for the third game, The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt. Before its release, over 1.5 million people had already pre-ordered the game, and within only its first 2 weeks, it sold over 4 million copies. Today, over 50 million copies of The Witcher 3 have been sold. Witcher 3, reintroducing some of the Slavic elements which had become more muted in the second game, and bringing a gorgeous, intricate open-world map to explore, captured the imaginations of audiences worldwide. The Witcher 3 achieved not only Game of the Year 2015, became not only one of the best-selling video games of all time, but had such effect on the gaming industry and fantasy pop culture that they can still be felt today, nearly 10 years after its release, and likely will be for a long time. Witcher 3 firmly planted the Witcher name in the minds of global audiences, not to mention English-speaking ones. Introduced to the world of The Witcher through CD Projekt's games, hordes of fantasy-hungry fans from the Anglosphere began to flood online spaces, seeking discussion, artwork, gameplay tips. They wanted everything under the Witcher name. And, intentionally or not, The Witcher was being consumed as transmedia. Because these new, ravenously curious fans went back to play the first 2 titles, as well as sought to read the books. At the same time, delays due to legal disputes held up the publishing of the books in English, a topic which we'll return to in the next video. This meant that even though fans of The Witcher began to want to buy and read the books, they had no official outlet to do so. They were eager to hear the next part of the story. They were pursuing that emotional connection. They wanted more Witcher, but it was not available to them. And, during this absence of the books, the games filled in. Because the games and the books told the Witcher story together, fans found themselves replaying the games while waiting for the book's translations, to fill the Witcher void in their heart. A discussion from August 2012 between fans on the Witcher 2 forums reads as such. I've read The Last Wish and The Blood of Elves, but it feels like years ago. I've been waiting for the next book long enough to forget it all. re-experienced The Witcher 2, and remember how much I was looking forward to the books. I'm still waiting for The Sword of Destiny, the second book after The Last Wish. This connection strengthened The Witcher in English as a transmedia storytelling experience. Unlike how it had been in Poland, where the books existed for years and years and were quite accessible and known, and most had likely read or at least known of the books before they played the games, in the English market, the fanbase was primarily comprised of those who had played the games, then got interested in the books. This audience then further supplemented their lack of access to the books with the games. But amongst these new, deeply loyal Witcher fans, this interest in the Witcher books became so strong that as fans got tired of waiting for official translations to come out, they took it upon themselves to translate and disseminate the books. It's only like 5 books, right?
What, like it's hard?
Many of these fan translators were Polish and translated the books wanting to share them with their fellow English fans, but some of these fan translators didn't even speak Polish, rather translating painstakingly from dictionaries and knowledge of other languages. Now, I can neither confirm nor deny if I ever took part in such fan translations. Hey, I bought them eventually. Twice! But they were, reportedly, as I've so heard, a kind of lifeline for Witcher fans, I'd say. With no other way to access them, how else were we supposed to read them? Something that this reminds me of is from when I was doing research for my previous video. It was then that I learned about unofficial translations of English language works in the Soviet bloc, books and manuscripts which were created and disseminated amongst readers due to censorship of the time. Some of these were even written by hand. Though the explicitly censored works were primarily political ones, lots of sci-fi and fantasy works were also not available specifically in Polish due to lack of resources, as in to get a translator, or in like the actual paper used to make new books. And this, though I get into it more in the other video, is why the magazine Fantastica flourished, because they had the state-funded resources to disseminate these English authors in Polish. So, something really curious is that the reverse occurred with The Witcher and its English audience. Instead of sci-fi and fantasy readers being driven to translate English authors into Polish, Witcher fans were desperate to translate the Polish Sapkowski into English. Though certainly these were really different contexts, these two inaccessibilities forcing a grassroots translation are really interesting as independent phenomena. Returning to The Witcher, this proliferation of fan translations serves to demonstrate the absolute passion and devotion which poured out of the community, for it wasn't only those writing the translations but those reading them. People, gamers, who had been exposed to The Witcher from the games, who became so interested in it that they were not only down to read an entire 7, soon-to-be 8 book series, but went and hunted down these books themselves, sometimes getting through weird grammar and spelling issues that they would never have tolerated from any other book. And we can consider this one positive effect which The Witcher being perceived as transmedia had on the books. It fostered the development of a league of devoted fans, one that could not only be classified as gamers, not only as readers, but a new branch of The Witcher fandom, an entirely unique identity of their own, defined not by a singular type of media, but by their own experiences and fight to access what they were interested in. But this was not the only effect which The Witcher being received as transmedia had in the Anglosphere. Now, let's talk about some effects of this transmedia perception which are more difficult to swallow. Part 4. Books based on games? For the English audience, The Witcher games, for the most part, superseded the books. And here is where I get to submit my own personal anecdotes as evidence. As you may be aware, I live in the United States, and you might be able to guess what has happened every single time I've brought up The Witcher books in a conversation with my real-life acquaintances. So, Nimue, what you been up to recently? Well, lately I've been rereading my favorite book series, The Witcher. The Witcher, isn't that a video game? Oh my gosh, I love The Witcher! You binged it on Netflix too? Dude, Witcher is awesome. I have like 1 billion hours in that game. Henry Cavill is so hot, right? I have only one question for you. Yen or Triss? Wait. There are books? For me, it's Triss all the way. She is so hot. Honestly, I don't disagree with that. She is hot. Ugh, Joy Beatty is so cute. Jaskier is my favorite character. I'm sorry for saying Jaskier is Jaskier, but it was intentional for that. Oh, I get it. The books are based on the games. La 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 la. Now, these anecdotal experiences are in no way representative of all audiences, but I'm telling you, just no one around me at least knows that The Witcher is a book series. People know The Witcher, but they don't know The Witcher. And this is why I think there are problems. Witcher as a name has been lauded as an example of a Polish title breaking into the English market, becoming popular amongst an English language audience. but really how much of that Polish title actually has. Because, side note, only the fans of the games which I've talked to in real life knew that Witcher takes influences from Slavic culture. But no one who knew The Witcher from only the Netflix series, its most insane incarnation. But no one who knew The Witcher from only the Netflix series, its most mainstream American incarnation, knew that The Witcher was Polish. And that's just sad to me. Now, this is all incidental, and my sample size is not reliable by any means. I'm not going up to random people on the sidewalk and asking them about The Witcher, though a potential video idea maybe? No. This is just friends and colleagues and coworkers, people who I've gotten into conversations with about our interests and hobbies. But even so, it's these interactions which make me ask, what are we doing here? How is Witcher being interpreted by English language audiences if the books, the original Witcher, have largely been overshadowed, nearly exempted from that influence? And it is not only I who has been bothered by this question.
Nie ma czegoś na świecie takiego, co można nazwać konwergencją mediów.
Książka jest książką, literatura jest literaturą.
Czyli, że komiks jest prequelem książki, a gra jest sequelem książki.
Nie mogą pretendować w żaden sposób do tego, że są sequelami, prequelami, czy coś tam się dzieje.
Nieprawda. Medium jest medium, gra jest grą. Kto sobie chce grać, niech sobie gra.
Gry, komiksy, filmy są tylko i wyłącznie adaptacjami.
Jakie postaci tam występują, w jakim czasie to się dzieje, nie ma absolutnie żadnego znaczenia.
Ale na pewno był taki target, który po grze dopiero sięgnął po książkę.
Mniemanie, że ja wiem, jak się zakończyła historia Wiedźmina po książce, co było dalej, bo dalej była gra, jest absolutnie błędne.
Książek napisanych na podstawie gry.
To nie jest prawda.
This whole video thus far has been about the concept of transmedia and media convergence, multiple media coming together to form an audience's collective experience. And we've looked at how this phenomenon helped The Witcher gain a following in the English language. But perhaps infamously, author Andrzej Sapkowski does not accept the concept of convergence and disagrees that games, movies, comics, or TV shows should be able to change how books are understood, that the book is the book, and everything else is derivative. Now, we're going to examine the validity of this counter-argument against transmedia, why he was dissatisfied with how the games affected the perception of his books. To do this, let's look at his explanation in non-silly montage form, to actually weigh what he has to say, because I think he makes some pretty solid points. Marcin Zwierchowski asks, what in retrospect is your attitude towards the Witcher game? You recently emphasized how much harm CD Projekt's works have done to the books. Sapkowski responds, I can't say much about the game as such because I don't know it, I don't play games. The publicity and sales figures speak for themselves. Would have been a weak game, it would not have such achievements. But by its success, the game, unfortunately, harmed my books. Several publishers put graphics from the game on the covers of my books. Many readers thus classify the books as so-called game-related, i.e. written for the game. There are a multitude of such books on the sci-fi and fantasy market. Seeing a picture from the game on the cover of my book, many fans assume that the game came first. And serious sci-fi and fantasy fans despise such secondary books and do not buy them, because, primo, they are secondary and unoriginal. Secundo, they are completely irrelevant to those who do not play any games, and such are the vast majority among fans. It doesn't help at all here that books for games happen to be written by the greats, such as Mike Resnick, Alan Dean Foster, Greg Bear, or Brandon Sanderson. The reaction of fans was unequivocal. The greats write under games solely for mammon, for pittance, and they certainly write carelessly, half-heartedly, so these books can be forgiven. Let gamers read them. I didn't enjoy it at book fairs or conventions when fans took my books in hand, looked at the covers, and scornfully put them down. Game-related. Games don't interest us. We'd rather pick up something original, a new Abercrombie, Aronovich, or Tregellis. I've been fighting the practice of using game graphics on my covers very actively for some time now, and I don't allow publishers to do so, where I can. And in the USA, for example, I can't. On the cover of the American edition of Time of Contempt, we have the Witcher alive from the game, fighting a sandworm from Dune. And I have to explain to fans that I wrote the book 12 years before the game was made, and that the Dune sandworm is from the game, not the book. In the book, there's not enough sandworms for even a medicament. Becoming the center of much online discourse, many fans were unhappy to hear their author coldly stating that he does not play video games, and seemingly renouncing his gamer readership. However, I don't interpret his statements here in quite that way. After all, he has stated before that he is grateful for every single reader he has, and he would be an idiot to not be. He has also often defended readers of fantasy against libel from the mainstream media. Additionally, he himself, though not a connoisseur of video games, found himself as a dungeon master in advanced D&D games, and was an early adopter of role-playing games in Poland. He had even intended to introduce the concept of RPGs to the market with his Eye of Yretz. So I'm not going to dismiss his claims here. In fact, I'm kind of going to agree with them, to an extent, but I'd like to dive a little bit deeper than going back and forth between sales numbers and speculations, and I want to approach this without the accusatory tone towards the games. Hopefully some of that will have already been established, as I've examined how the books likely wouldn't have risen to such success in the English market without the games. I feel like I can safely dispute Sapkowski's claim in that the games have certainly not financially harmed his books. Quite the opposite. But we can examine this claim of harm in an altogether different way, as in having harmed their interpretation as literature. I want to look at the actual makings of the books and of the games to see how interpretation of The Witcher as transmedia fundamentally changed the ways in which these separate works were understood. I want to do this because on this channel, I'd like to do literary analysis of The Witcher books. Now, there are many different approaches to literary theory and criticism. However, most all methodologies of literary theory involve three elements. Firstly, the text, secondly, the author, and third, the audience. Though some methodologies deliberately eliminate some of these elements, maybe only focusing on the text or only on the author, the exempted elements still exist. In any case, these three elements are the foundation for any analysis which occurs, and when we look to The Witcher as it entered the English language sphere as unintentional transmedia storytelling, we run into challenges approaching it with analysis, examining its meaning, because each of these three elements changed between the books and the games. Examining the differences in these elements, I'd like to propose three major challenges which occur when attempting to analyze The Witcher as transmedia storytelling, the most common interpretation of it in the English language. Before I do that, just to say that I myself got into The Witcher through the third game, and I, at various times, have myself been guilty of all of these confusions. And there will be a little bit of spoilers in this part, though I'll try to keep them vague. It has to do with both the endings of the books and the games, so it's kind of unavoidable here. Primo, the text. This first challenge is about the mediums in which the books and games exist as works of art. Methods of storytelling differ between different mediums. How a book tells a story and what makes a book good is different from how a video game tells a story and what makes a video game good. Though the Witcher saga often tells its story in a non-linear way, it is a closed and linear story in the sense that it is a book series. What has been written, and there is no changing the words already printed on the page. And The Witcher, specifically, is about this very concept. This is mostly relevant to further on in the saga, especially in the last book of the cycle, Lady of the Lake, but The Witcher, in one of its aspects, centers around this theme of destiny.
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 A destiny.
To my destiny.
No, not like that. Destiny, predestination, fate are what tangles the characters up, sets them in motion, ties them down to what has already been decided. And, in a very postmodern way, przepraszam pan Sapkowski, this in-universe concept of destiny is equated with our universe's concept of storytelling, writing, the book itself. Because their destiny is the story, it is the writing. It's what has already been decided by the author, by his pen. Or rather, his keyboard. These characters within a book cannot escape their destinies, because everything has already been thought up, written, edited, sent to print, bound, and delivered into the reader's hands. The letters in ink are already printed on the page. For all of these characters, there is no possibility for change. There is no way to escape this tragedy they've been written in. They're bound to their fates, every last one of them. Except for one, Ciri, the child of destiny, whose elder blood allows her the power to travel to other stories, to jump between them, to escape. And thus, Sapkowski creates a story about stories, a book series, for which the medium of a book is absolutely essential. And the games do exactly the opposite. The games are about choice. They not only necessitate, but pride an open and branching story. Remember, a huge element of what made the entire trilogy so remarkable and made it stand out in the gaming landscape was the element of choice, the ability to choose and change where the story goes, how it ends. I quote again from GameSpy in 2007, The bigger of the two factors which really pushed The Witcher over the top was the game's moral ambiguity, a series of moral choices presented to the player where the impact of the choice isn't felt until much later in the game. In The Witcher games, you can change destiny. Unlike the books, there is not only one ending. Various paths have been written out, but the one you receive hasn't. It all comes down to what you do as a player. This is an integral part of the game's play, which, according to scholarship, is a fundamental factor of video games as a very concept. In video games, play is situated at the center of the audiovisual and kinetic experience, introducing innovative change in audiovisual production and reception patterns. The ability to choose and the ability to make decisions, which will affect your gameplay and the story which is told, is the key factor in the very concept of a video game. Even the earliest text-based games, a digital evolution of the pen and paper role-playing games, were precedented on these choices. So, both the Witcher books and the games play to their absolute strengths in the mediums which they are. But if you try to combine the strengths of these mediums, it's like fire and ice. What's good for one is at best not the point of, and at worst terrible for, the other. The closed cycle of the books and their inability to change their ending is their point. The open-endedness of the games and the ability to change their ending is their point. But when the books are inherently seen as part of this larger transmedia, rather than in the virtue of their own medium as intended, that takes away from their intended artistic message. Secundo, the author. This second challenge is about how the author intended the world, and as a result, how we see the world. I mentioned earlier that for the English audience, there was no need to imagine Geralt for themselves, because he had already been thoroughly imagined by CD Projekt. In one way, this was a market advantage for the Witcher books, as this visual representation was not only very strong, representing a Witcher world which resonated with readers, but also gave image to names and places and objects which, prior to this, had no official depiction as thorough as that as which the games introduced. This visual element engaged fans in transmedia storytelling, working alongside the books to build the world. But now we come to discussing the downside of that, because there is one immense caveat to this artistic depiction. CD Projekt's Witcher is just one studio's interpretation of the world, and furthermore, is not intended to be a one-to-one exact replication of Sapkowski's Witcher. Certainly they adapted the world, the characters, even some dialogue and storylines directly from the books, but the Witcher games are their own works of art, created not to be the books, but created with inspiration from them. They had their own goals, both artistic and professional, in mind when creating the games, which were not the same intents as Sapkowski's, because it may be obvious, but the books and the games have two separate authors. Or the games have hundreds of authors if you count everyone who's ever contributed to them, but just for the sake of not getting too far into the weeds here, let's count CD Projekt's authorship as one united studio. When you have two separate authors, you have two separate visions, intentions, messages which they like to imbue their work with, and finally, the worlds they create. Unlike how The Matrix was envisioned as a transmedia experience from the beginning by its authors working together, the creation of the Witcher games followed the creation of the books, and were not made involving consultation with their author. Sapkowski often adopts the attitude of do whatever you want when it comes to adaptations, for better and for worse. Thus, CD Projekt's Witcher, though it may have great similarities in subject matter, tone, and feeling, is not Sapkowski's Witcher. And neither does it want to be, and neither does it need to be. But when you interpret the works together as transmedia, you fall into a very complicated web of mixed authorial intent. What Sapkowski intends for Geralt, and what CD Projekt intends for Geralt, are two very separate things. And because of this separate authorship, although they bear the same name, they fit the same appearance, they have the same backstories, they are not the same character. But for those interpreting the story as a long one continuum, it becomes very difficult to entangle Sapkowski's Geralt from CD Projekt's Geralt. Where does one end and the other begin? I've detailed how readers of the Witcher book series got into it through the games, eager to seek out background for the world they were introduced to. But the Witcher books were not written as backstory for the games. They were a closed story cycle all of their own, and function as such. But the games are narrative continuations. They take place following the ending of the books. So the game's characters and the game's world are based upon those from the books, where Sapkowski left off. And the books in English, well, except for the very recent hardcover editions, do not have visual representations of their own, save for what's on the covers, which, as Sapkowski bemoaned, are sometimes art from the games. This art, which led many to wrongfully believe that the books were based on the games, unless they actually looked into it more, but how many are going to do that research? And this depressing misperception of the Witcher books as secondary to the games and as an accessory to the Witcher story doesn't extend to only common fans like you and me, but also to those in the Anglosphere who had the charge of creating their own Witcher media for mass audiences, resulting in a long, drawn-out game of telephone, in which the message of The Witcher in English has degraded severely over time. For example, the Netflix Witcher series star Henry Cavill was introduced to The Witcher through the third game, and thought that the books were based on the games until he received the role of Geralt and had to read the books.
I played the video games before reading the books. Yeah. I thought the books were based upon the games because anytime I saw a Witcher book, it was always game art on the cover. And after meeting with Lauren, she told me about the books.
And Cavill's understanding of Geralt as primarily a character from The Witcher 3, and only secondarily from the books, resulted in his acting, interpretation, and characterization of Geralt in the Netflix series being based on the perception of Geralt from the third game, even though the Netflix series was intended to be an adaptation of the books. And Cavill's depiction of Geralt, which became very popularized in the English language market, was even further from the books than the games had been, which further complicated people's understanding of who Geralt of Rivia is, or at least who Geralt in the books is, because many will wrongfully assume that Netflix Geralt and game Geralt are equivalent to the book Geralt, when in fact the book Geralt is his own character in his own story from his own world.
But they're changing their actor anyway, so maybe Liam Hemsworth will be better. Oh. Yeah.
Those who went into the books from the games did not go into it blind. They saw a picture of Geralt of Rivia, a promotional graphic, a digital player avatar, and that, more than likely, became their Geralt. But Geralt doesn't have a set appearance. I'm being a bit metaphorical here, but what I mean is, apply this talk about imagining Geralt to imagining Yennefer, or any of the characters, or any of the world. These characters in this world were already defined for the majority of the English readers, in part by Serre Project's interpretation, and suffice it to say, that was not Andrzej Sapkowski's authorial intent when he wrote the books.
Don't cross the streams.
Now, appearances are of negligible significance. If the Geralt in your mind has a scar over his eye, that doesn't really affect the whole meaning of the work. But what does is the writing. For it wasn't just appearances which were affected by the game's interpretation, but the characterization, the world building, the lore. Practically every Witcher fan will tell you that once you've been exposed to multiple canons, it becomes very tricky to try and distinguish between what belongs to the games, what belongs to the books, or even, no, that happened in the Netflix series. And this further complicates things when fans begin to retroactively apply game lore to book interpretation, because what is canon to the games is not canon to the books. This is much to the chagrin of the most involved Witcher fans, but for a lot of more casual fans, why care? Why bother to distinguish between game, book, show? It's all Witcher anyway. For most fans, it's all one universe. For the majority of the audience that is exposed to the transmedia storytelling first, and is not going to bother to look into those separate media, make those distinctions, they can come away with some very different, unintentional takeaways than if they had been exposed to each media separately. Tercio, the audience. Finally, we come to our third challenge, which has to do with the audience. Us. Now, how the audience of The Witcher changed can be examined in many different ways, from culture to language to time, and I'll also look at it from these angles shortly. But on the subject of transmedia storytelling, let's zero in on Sapkowski's accusation regarding readership. Serious readers of science fiction and fantasy despise such literature based on games and do not buy it. Such readers are the overwhelming majority. In this statement, he drew a strict line between those who read books and those who play games. And I think that this is why many were not so keen on this judgment of his. Readers and gamers overlap. It's not like you can't read books and play video games, maybe not at the same time, but you can certainly have a passion for both, particularly for young people such as myself, who grew up with both mediums available to them. Probably, if they are not already doing both, they were at least peripherally aware of the other hobby, what it entails, some of its most famous titles. Furthermore, what Sapkowski had to say goes against how Witcher was given to and seen by the English audience. What we've been discussing all along, transmedia storytelling, which is exactly what those books based on games he mentions are. And this is where there is some merit to what Sapkowski says after all. Yes, certainly you can both read books and play video games, but there's a Venn diagram, a continuum, a Kinsey scale, or however else you want to visualize it, where you invariably have people who like both, but at the same time on opposite ends, you have very devoted readers and very devoted gamers. Sapkowski, being a very devoted reader himself, an avid fantasy fan, reading something like 50 books a year.
How many books do you read in a year?
100. Not 100, but 80 titles a year. 80.
Was expecting to appeal to that crowd, which he has been a part of for a very long time. Serial readers invested in their favorite genre who will pick up all the new releases. Instead, his work was promoted by their English publisher towards the crowd at the entirely opposite end of the spectrum, serial gamers, invested in their favorite titles who will pick up a book of the same name. And this upset him because he didn't write to appeal to those who play video games, he wrote to appeal to those that read books. Now, why would he be mad about that? An audience is an audience. Does he not want the readership of gamers? I don't think it's so much that he doesn't want gamers to read him, but that he was more so looking forward to readers reading him. Because The Witcher is filled with inspirations and borrowings from other fantasy works, it's parodical and a deconstruction of the genre. Witcher, as a work, is fundamentally in constant dialogue with other fantasy works from the same genre, and when it was not marketed to this audience but rather to gamers instead, you cease to have as many interconnections between fantasy literature, comparing the Witcher books with other titles from across the genre, and begin to have more intraconnections made within the Witcher transmedia, comparisons between the games and the books. Sapkowski sold the rights to create a Witcher video game to CD Projekt Red, but he did not sign up to have his books constantly compared to the games. So this change in audience and the canons and conventions that they're familiar with, and simply what they're interested in, will affect how the books are interpreted. If you're not savvy to exactly the kinds of worlds, characters, tropes, and assumptions which Sapkowski wrote Witcher in correspondence with, you're going to have a very hard time understanding what he intends to subvert and play around with. And I'm not saying this because I look down on those who haven't read and don't know. I'm saying it because I am those myself. Witcher reintroduced me to fantasy, but I'm not well read in it yet outside of Witcher. Most of these references either had to be explained to me or I had to research them myself. I'm not saying I won't read more fantasy titles, the classics, the foundations of the genre. I'm planning to in time, but I bring this up because I myself, probably like a lot of other English language fans, am evidence of this readership. And it's a readership which we might consider unexpected. Conclusion: the law of surprise. Because of the game's predominance amongst the English audience, because the Witcher books were marketed to gamers and not readers, they gained readership from those who are not serious readers of science fiction and fantasy, as Sapkowski put it. People who were maybe not even readers at all. People who didn't care about reading, had bad experiences with it, or had just fallen out of love. Who felt that sci-fi and fantasy didn't have a place for them. Witcher, for these fans, brought them to read. So, although the book's affiliation with the games may have turned away the more established readers, in this sense, the game's affiliation with the books attracted, or perhaps created, a different kind of reader. One who was not a reader, but became inducted or re-inducted into the cult of reading by The Witcher. In this way, Sapkowski made readers out of people he never set out to make readers of, which he once stated was his mission as a writer. Sometimes people ask me about my mission, about my vocation. If you can talk about such a thing at all, for me it is some kind of contribution to the fight for reading, for language, for culture. If it is thanks to me that someone who has never read reached for a book, then I have a sense of mission accomplished. I'd like to hazard an analogy here. After invoking the law of surprise, Geralt returned to Sintra in 6 years, to look destiny in the eyes, seeking Princess Pavetta's son. But Pavetta did not have a son. She just happened to have a daughter instead. And, well, after some tragic incidents, this daughter became a Witcher all the same. Now, that's not to say that this final challenge ceases to be a challenge, because, damn, I've got some reading to do, but to give us a little optimism for where we stand. We're not wrong, we're just new and uncharted territory. We cannot change how The Witcher coming to the English market as transmedia has affected the book's interpretation, but we can begin to understand how it has affected their interpretation and be mindful of that when conducting our analysis of them. As I talk about the books on this channel, I have to remain cognizant of the fact that for many, this is not the Witcher that they know. They may not even know the books exist, or they may know them only so far as backstory for the games, or even as books based on games. And there are a few more reasons for this than what we've covered so far. Next time, I'd like to turn to a specific aspect of Sapkowski's aforesaid complaint, the way the Witcher books were positioned and marketed by the English publisher, and, following that, how the readers receive them. I'll see you then, on a new Vitre. Thank you for watching, and I hope that you found this video interesting. I also want to say thank you to everyone for the positive feedback on my previous video, and even more special thanks to all who supported the channel on Ko-fi, helping me to create this video and more. You are awesome. I hope to see you again soon with the next episodes in this essay series. Until then, stay curious.